Hello and welcome to our second episode of Geopolitics with Swasti with our consulting editor and foreign policy expert Swasti Rao. Thank you so much for watching our first episode and asking so many questions. We've been keeping track of all of them, and if we don't answer them in this episode, then we definitely will take them in upcoming ones. So we've actually got some really interesting questions for you today, Swasti, ranging from the US to DeepSeek to Ukraine. Shall we begin?
Well, of course. And before you begin, let me just sort of reiterate that this is the purpose of this particular show, that we would like the viewers also to learn directly and also just ask as many questions as they want.
Yeah.
Only that we have a bit of a limitation in terms of how many can we select for one episode. But for sure, we will always try and make up later.
Yeah, and we also prioritize our members' questions. If you want to keep asking, please do consider becoming a member of ThePrint. Just kick off, I'm actually combining two questions from our members, one from at Ravi89Rules and at Sanjit Suman. So they're curious about the future of India and US ties and are asking whether there will be direct pressure and demands from Trump to ask India to step back from groups like the BRICS and SEO and oil and trade relations with countries like Russia and Iran. They've observed that there hasn't been the typical kind of bonhomie that we've come to expect with Modi and Trump. And what's more is that there also seems to be an improvement in US and China ties. So do you think that Trump is going to use tariff and immigration threats to coerce India into becoming a formal US treaty ally?
So, Ravi, let me just start from the last bit of your question. Will India become a formal US treaty ally? The answer is no. And now I'll sort of, work it backwards and tell you how I have kind of arrived at it. But, so now let's begin from the beginning, which is that why the future of India-US ties. See, there is no doubt about the fact that the US is, if not the most important, one of the most important. And I would say it wouldn't be an overstatement, frankly, Vandana, if we say that the US is the most important strategic partner to India. Look at the trade. I mean, the bilateral trade is already about $120 billion. If you add services to that, it's $190 billion, right? India's combined trade with the EU is, not even that much or close to that much. So it's just that one country. And what makes this trade important is that India has a trade surplus of about $36-37 billion there. Similarly, when it comes to remittances, because India has this amazing widespread millions and millions of people, like as diaspora living there, the remittances that we get from the US are also, about 120 billion. In fact, data tells us that in the last financial year, our remittances were much greater than our total FDI.
Right.
So the total FDI stood at about $70 or $72 billion, but the remittances alone were about $120 to $124 billion, right? And the lion's share of that actually came from the US. So that's another part. Similarly, if you look at defense, just in the last one decade or even less, India-US defense ties have dramatically increased. Today, we stand at about 20 or 25 billion worth of defense equipment trade. Not only that, US is also the number one destination for India's defense exports, according to the report that was released by MOD. So basically, it tells you that US is pretty indispensable for India today, especially in the way that geopolitical order and the strategic calculus has been changing and become very fluid because of wars and COVID and the China factor, of course, and India's aspirations to grow quickly. Now, very quickly, also the larger convergence in the geopolitical realm is going to continue, which is on China. So I wanted to first tell the good part, but then there is also something that we need to be careful about. What is it? If you look at Trump's repeated insistence on calling India a tariff abuser, asking India, or not just India, but also through India, the larger BRICS countries, the BRICS groupings, that he's not going to tolerate anything when it comes to de-dollarization, etc. It has two kind of impacts. One is the rhetorical impact, and the rhetorical impact is that would it mean India is going to leave these groupings? No, and I'll come to it. But the real impact is something that we need to discuss better. In the aspect of trade, India will have to give concessions to the US. In
Yeah, sorry. What I wanted to say is the fundamental issue is that India is exporting more to the US than it's importing.
Absolutely, yeah,
Which is why,
we have a
which is,
trade surplus.
yeah.
So on the question of trade, because I told you that we have a net trade surplus, and that is also very important for us because our next two biggest trading partners, like China and Russia, both of whom with both of these trading relationships are in India's export deficit, by the way. Okay, coming back, on the question of trade, India will have to give concessions. India will have to either give more market access to the US, or by removing its tariffs or lowering its tariffs, or India will have to buy more hydrocarbons. Now, I have repeatedly maintained that when it comes to doing something about the trade deficit that we have with the US, India is certainly going to buy more hydrocarbons. In fact, the Trump 1.0 administration also forced us in many ways to buy at least 7 billion worth of American oil. And this is something that I see repeating. Secondly, you also saw how quickly the Indian MEA was forthcoming in kind of falling in line with the American insistence on legal migration and saying that all right, all those detainees or all those illegal immigrants should come back, and India really supports legal migration. And there also the question perhaps is the remittances, because we really don't want to do anything to disturb that. I told you that we earn much more from remittances than we do from FDI. We have not been able to make use of the China +1 diversification. So I think this is something that we need to really balance out much better. So this is like the other part. On the question of de-dollarization, see, the BRICS currency was never on the table from India's side. India would never go for a BRICS currency because if you really look at the economic composition of the BRICS economies, right, it's basically dominated by China. So it doesn't make any sense for India to support China's grip on de-dollarized trade, because what is happening as a result of de-dollarization is a strengthening of yuanization of trade. Okay, so India has no interest there. India is interested in de-dollarization if the international payments are getting increasingly settled in Indian rupees.
Right.
Okay, and that is why India supports local payments and local currencies. Now, Trump might also force India to sort of tone down rhetoric there, or tone down its posturing there, in case it is seemed or it comes across as a threat to the dominance of the dollar. So when it comes to these things, I think Trump is going to be far less tolerant of India's multi-alignment, of India's strategic autonomy, and frankly, I think there would be lesser room for it. I mean, I do not see it otherwise. And this, in many ways, is both, I would say, a bad news for those that were thinking that Trump is going to come and everything is going to be hunky-dory between India and the US. But yes, despite these glitches, the larger overall, the larger convergence is going to continue very quickly, because otherwise it will not make sense to you. You mentioned that there has been a thawing of relations between US and China, because Trump has invited Xi Jinping, but probably did not invite Prime Minister Modi. That said, Trump has also been trying to signal and posture a lot of good things about Xi Jinping, calling him a great man, etc. I think this is something which is tactical, because that is basically aimed at perhaps trying to bring about an end to the Russia-Ukraine war, considering that China's support to Russia is instrumental in letting it sort of fight this war of grinding attrition for so long. So perhaps it's aimed more at that than a real thaw, because as far as the tariff rhetoric is concerned against China, it's pretty much the same. When he says no tolerance to BRICS currency, China is the main player there. When he says de-dollarization, no tolerance to de-dollarization, it's China that is the main player there. So, cutting a long story short, yes, India's relationship with the US under Trump will really test the limits of India's strategic autonomy, and I frankly do not see that India will be able to have the same kind of maneuverability that it earlier had.
Does that mean that India might leave the SCO?
Not at all. See, one also has to understand that India's posture there has been very pragmatic. India has been forthcoming in conveying to its partners, especially the US here, that India's presence in SCO and BRICS is not really to add to the anti-Western rhetoric of some of its members like of course, China, Russia, and Iran, but to actually retain its non-Western flavor.
Right.
So I think India has been very intelligently pushing it and posturing it as India's expression of multipolarity and multilateralism and all of that, and actually convincing the West that if we are there, then basically these groupings retain their non-Western flavor.
Right.
If we are not there, they become completely anti-Western. And in fact, it also makes sense for the West, frankly, because there is no other country in those groupings that can really take the leadership of the global South if India were to sort of leave these groupings. So India should not leave these countries. It is also in the larger interest of the collective West, not just India's.
We have 2 questions from our member at Karthik Parashar 2883. Thanks for commenting and asking Swasti so many good questions. He asks for an update on TAPI, which is the Tajikistan-Afganistan-Pakistan-India pipeline. What can you tell us about that?
Okay, just to clarify, the T in TAPI doesn't stand for Tajikistan, it stands for Turkmenistan. Okay, and so very quickly, TAPI, that is short for Turkmenistan, T for Turkmenistan, A for Afghanistan, P for Pakistan, and I for India. This has been a wonderful gas pipeline project, and of course it's not working, but I'll just tell you what are the good parts and then what are the bad parts and what should India expect. In short, you see, India is a net importer of natural gas as well, okay? And India is completely dependent, mostly dependent on imports. So about 10 years ago, there was this idea that was floated. If you remember, 10 years ago, there was a democratically elected government in Afghanistan. Turkmenistan is actually key here because Turkmenistan is one of the Central Asian republics, 5 Central Asian republics. And if you look at the map, you see that Turkmenistan is along the banks of the Caspian Sea. And Caspian Sea has one of the world's largest reserves of natural gas. In fact, that geographical position actually makes Turkmenistan one of the top 5 reserves of natural gas. So, and traditionally, because they're militarily dependent on Russia, earlier Soviet Union and then Russia, and economically dependent on China. So the Central Asian countries practice a kind of foreign policy which is known as multi-vector foreign policy, that they would like to diversify. That's another word for diversification. So 10 years ago when the idea came, it was a good idea because it was giving the Central Asian Republic, especially Turkmenistan, which is also relatively more neutral than the other countries. I mean, we can talk about it some other time. But so it gave Turkmenistan the leverage to then export its natural gas to newer markets, etc. So it was supposed to start. So this is about 1,800 kilometer or about 2,000 kilometer long pipeline starting from Turkmenistan. So carrying gas from there, then bringing inside Afghanistan. In Afghanistan, starting from Herat and then Kandahar, and then entering Pakistan in Quetta, and then finishing in Punjab. In India. So that was the pipeline. That was the route of the pipeline. Now, what happened was that, of course, such kind of a pipeline project, it never could take off really because the situation in Afghanistan changed with the Taliban takeover. Right. Now, when the Taliban took over, initially, they were the ones that were trying to sabotage the project because the US was backing it then, because that, if you know that entire thing of US involvement in Afghanistan, it goes back to that era. Yeah. Now then Taliban were the ones that were actually attacking it, etc. And then the general mood was a little low because of this. Once the Taliban took over, happened and everything, then people started to again talk about stabilizing the situation there. And very recently, I think a few months ago, the Taliban actually, with a lot of fanfare, said that we are going to be relaunching this pipeline. And I guess perhaps your question is also coming from there. Now, very quickly, in terms of realities, the way they are today, there is no financial backing for the project. So the financial backing would, which means that the cost of actually constructing this pipeline is to the tune of about $10 billion. Who's going to give the money? With the US is backing out. Afghanistan doesn't have money. Pakistan doesn't have money. India doesn't want to commit any money. Now, this makes the project very vulnerable because China can take over. In fact, it was attractive for India because there was no China in this, right? So that's one problem. The other problem is geopolitical and also the tensions, because it's not just, even though the situation in Afghanistan is stable, but if you look at the India-Pakistan relations, or if you look at Afghanistan-Pakistan relations, if you know that there's been so much violence between the two countries, between the two sides on the question of TTP and the question of, airstrikes. Pakistan has been conducting airstrikes, etc. So it's a very, very geopolitically contested space. The rural line is not peaceful. So in such a situation, tell me, how on earth are you really ensuring a kind of stability where somebody will come and put that finance which is required to build such an expensive pipeline? So all said and done, I think the TAP part might still be there if China were to take over. But it's not happened. But right now, there's nothing in it for India, frankly. So the eye is already dropped. Don't expect anything from it. So TAP is pretty much dead on arrival. It's never really taken off, even though Afghanistan is trying to push for it. But I don't see that happening because of these very genuine problems.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah, sure.
Did it come up in the recent meeting between the Taliban and India?
It's always, I think, I did not check those details, so I will have to go and check, that. But I mean, in many ways, these kind of pipelines are again an expression of India's, multi-alignment, because India is actually looking in that region. India is looking at multiple routes, right? So India is not only there in terms of the INSTC, which is, connecting India, Bombay, then from Iran, Azerbaijan, and all the way to Russia. But India also had this pipeline connectivity. Then India is also looking at IMEC connectivity, and India is looking at I2U2 and all the strategic partnerships there. So but frankly, if you ask me, there is no official withdrawal from India's side, and because official withdrawal doesn't make any sense. But in terms of practicality, I think there is no backing for it. And on the contrary, if India really has to put its currency, geopolitical currency or financial currency, into these projects, it makes more sense to stick to things like INSTC, where there is trade happening. And by the way, both IMEC, the IMEC corridor, as well as the I2U2 grouping, which also talks about energy. I think last episode we did a bit of a coverage on that. All of these have clean energy, so to say, connectivity goals. So I think if you also look at in terms of what kind of members are there and what kind of strategic closeness does India have with those members, like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, etc., that perhaps is a game which can give India better returns than TAPI because of all the reasons that I just told you.
Got it. Thank you. Kartik Parashar also says he rarely hears about the India-Myanmar relationship. What's the current status of our relationship with Myanmar?
Well, that's an unusual question because not many people ask about it. So very quickly, India and Myanmar obviously always had good relations, especially when there was a democratically elected government there. Also, please remember that from India's perspective, the more you hear about India's look east policy and act east policy, Myanmar is the only ASEAN country. ASEAN is a group of 10 Southeast Asian countries, right? And Myanmar is the only ASEAN country that shares a border with India. So from India's perspective, it's a gateway to Southeast Asia, right? And that's why Myanmar has been very important. Now, things changed in 2021, I think, when the junta, the military junta, kind of took over. And India has been that India has, especially in its neighborhood, India has been wary of engaging with all stakeholders, but has always preferred pro-India factions and democratically elected leaders, which again, something that India is now trying to change. Okay, but nonetheless, it's been important. Now, what has happened that after 2021, the ties have been pretty much, I would say, in a freeze, not a total freeze, because of course we do keep talking. There's a question of Rohingyas. Of course, you know that the Rohingyas, Muslims, are being persecuted, and then as a result, they also find refuge in India. And that becomes very, very uncontrolled and unregulated. So apart from the Bangladesh Hindus that are also coming to India, you also have a Rohingya problem. So of course, this is a very, very difficult situation. But that's not the only thing why India needs to engage Myanmar. Of course, in terms of projects, we have a Kaladan multimodal project, and we have also a India, Myanmar, Thailand trilateral kind of a highway road project. Nothing much is happening there. But I'll tell you something which makes Myanmar so important for us, and that is the question of China. Even if you look at China, if you look at the map, basically Myanmar provides direct access to the Indian Ocean region, and also reduces China's dependence on the Malacca Strait. And if you know the strategic relevance of the Malacca Strait, it's a choke point, right? And it's also called China's vulnerability. So China would like to have have a direct access to Indian Ocean, and Myanmar actually kind of fits the bill perfectly, and that is why China has been present there in a big way. China has signed a BRI project with Myanmar. It's called China-Myanmar Economic Corridor, the CMEC, right? And this is just one of the string of pearls BRI projects which are kind of encircling India. So in the recent years, China has also been brokering a lot of talks and peace between the junta and the different armed rebellion groups. So what I'm saying is that, again, India runs the risk of being alienated from a region that was so crucial to its Act East and Look East policy. But because India doesn't come with the same kind of deep pockets as China does, there are certain limits to how much India can engage. Very quickly, in my opinion, the solution is that perhaps India should definitely be working more on the two projects that I told you about, but should also try and engage the big players in the region. So, for example, Japan is a big player in that region. The European Union is a big player in the region, and perhaps look at more triangular cooperation frameworks or trilateral frameworks to really sort of engage Myanmar.
This is an interesting question from another member at Navneet Rohila. He wants to know your thoughts on a trend he's observed. He says that many Indian defense commentators on YouTube portray India as a global military powerhouse and sometimes shows Russia as superior to both the US and China. So he asks, given that you have personally visited Ukraine and observed the situation up close, how do you view such narratives? And I also want to add something that another member at Ravi89 Rules has observed. He says that China seems to have spooked the US with both DeepSeek, AI, and a show of military strength, right? With 2 new fighter aircrafts and their shipbuilding capacity. So he's asking if you think India's story is one of missed opportunities, playing catch up with China when it comes to, especially when it comes to science, technology, manufacturing, and defense.
Now, what I first want to say before I answer the question is the viewers are very intelligent. They actually ask questions really in spirals. So even though technically it's one question,
they're very loaded,
very, very loaded, and with, multiple
layers,
multiple layers. So, but that's quite intelligent, So that's a compliment. Very quickly, So the first part of the question about certain YouTubers or a lot of popular commentary. Let's not just single out YouTube. Let's just say that the popular commentary, right? I think all countries find it justified to sort of talk about self-pride and national pride. And, these things are an eternal feel-good for all nation states. So I don't really find anything wrong with that. The problem happens when it is not evidence-based, And the problem also happens when it comes in the way of us trying to develop and trying to improve. I think that's where the problem happens. And I'll just give you certain evidence-based analyses to sort of help you understand that better. Now, very quickly, when you say that, is India a military powerhouse? See, India is not a military powerhouse. Let's just face it. Yes, we are dependent on military imports. We are one of the biggest importers of military equipment for decades, now. That's why we are trying so hard to diversify and also to indigenize. But India is not a military powerhouse in any way. Look at our, our STAR program, the Tejas. And by the way, I have done the couple of worldviews on this, and I've been writing on it and all that. Really? So let's be realistic here, okay? India is a formidable power in its own way. India has great strengths, but military superiority or being the military powerhouse is not really one of them. We are on the way. It's a work in progress. That is a fair assessment. But look at Tejas. I mean, the very fact that we are still struggling with indigenizing it in a true sense, because it is an indigenous program. But look at the engines. They're imported. We are not able to develop, the last time I went into length and breadth of why we're not able to develop a Kaveri engine. Right now, it's at a different stage, and now we want a foreign collaborator to kind of finish that project. The air-to-air refueling, if you look at Tejas, is coming from the UK. The radars are coming from Israel. The weapons are a mix of course, indigenous and imported weapons. But similarly, take the naval capabilities, not just the submarines, but the stealth frigates, etc., etc. Even if the design is indigenous, I mean, especially the latest inductions, but the engines, again, we are critically dependent on foreign partners. We are many years away from developing our own. Now, again, if you look at the situation on the land, apart from the Arjun main battle tank or the Zorawar light tanks, I mean, they're all not completely indigenous, especially the Zorawar light tanks. But everything else is completely imported, right? From small arms to large arms, we are heavily dependent on imports. And not to say that we have not exported weapons. Of course, these days you hear so much about Pinakas, for example, that we are now, exporting to Armenia, and the Indian Army has just now given a huge order, also for that. But at the same time, you please understand that if you look at the general artillery guns also, right? So the very fact that it was Bofor's guns from Sweden that really helped us turn the tide in the Kargil war, or the Mirage aircraft again in the Kargil war, or the entire mediumization that we've been trying to do. So mediumization is a process by which we are trying to modernize our artillery guns. Even that is something that we have not been able to do, frankly, without the help of many of our Western partners. Yeah. So I think then you can perhaps also give the example of BrahMos, that we export BrahMos as such a... But, Russia has not really shared the IP of BrahMos with us. So Russia is still retaining its superiority when it comes to BrahMos. Russia is what... Russia is the partner that has the real chabi to it, not India. But does that mean that we should not celebrate India's successes? No, that's not the point. The point is that when you call India a military powerhouse, how exactly do you define it? And according to the definitions that are generally accepted in the strategic community, in the in these communities, you would say that, yeah, for a country to be really identified as a powerhouse, okay, there has to be certain markers. So India could be on its way, but frankly, India cannot do it solo, and it really needs the help of its partners. There's also a second part to that question, which was about the performance of US weapons versus Russian weapons and all. Now, again, if you go by a lot of rhetoric, you would see that, oh, Russian weapons are very good, etc. I think the problem happens because it's not really coming from technical sources so much. It is coming from the fact that we consider Russia a friend. So that analysis is situated in, or rooted in a lot of friendliness, right? And we say, oh, Russian weapons are great. I mean, Russian weapons are good. But at the same time, when we are looking at Western weapons, because there is so much prevalent anti-Westernism in India, and especially in the strategic discourse that you cannot trust the US, etc. Therefore, those elaborations are also sort of rooted in that mistrust, and saying that, oh, you can't trust the Americans, etc. But if you really ask me for an objective analysis, again, you have to take take into account the fact that the only way that you can say a weapon is better than some another or its counterpart, or its another weapon, is how it behaves in war, how it performs in war, right? It is not about how it performs in controlled conditions in a laboratory, right? Please understand that. And in fact, that has been the key takeaway why China is so interested in Russia-Ukraine war, because Americans have already noticed that what the Chinese have done is that Chinese have convinced the Russians to share the real-time performance of Western weapons, because China has never really fought a real war with the West. So that is the real thing, that war is the ultimate test. And if you look at the wars, for example, at least in the last 50 years or so, right? You had the Gulf War, the first and the second Gulf War. You had Syria. You had wars in Middle East, in Afghanistan, of course, right? You see that the Western weapons have fared better. You can pick up one example here or nitpick on something, that's a different thing, but it's there.
As a generalized,
and also the West, this is not again to say that the Western weapons are perfect or the American weapons are perfect, okay? Look at the case of the Patriot air defense system, for example. Now the Patriot air defense systems, from the time it was used in the first generation of the Gulf Wars, etc., they used that data to refine it and refine its precision, etc. So all these things are always a work in progress, please understand. But when it comes to comparing what is better, what is more precise, of course the 155 ammunition shells are more precise than 122 ammunition shells, and 155 is the NATO standard. Where is the doubt? And that is the shell that is not reaching Ukraine, and why the Ukrainians are dying, etc. So you have to keep that in mind, that what really is the frame of reference here. Now, again, I mean, the other example that comes to my mind is Serbia, because if you remember that very unfortunate war of the breakup of Yugoslavia in Europe that kind of lasted 1 decade, things went very, very bloody before NATO intervened. And of course, a lot of people look at it as NATO's indiscriminate bombing. But in terms of the performance of weapons, is what I'm trying to tell you, is that kind of turned the tide and put put together a different kind of an outcome of the bloody wars of Yugoslav, breakup, because it was a completely air-dominated kind of an intervention where NATO started bombing Serbia, and Serbia was backed by Russia at that time. So, I mean, I can just go on doing it, but then you will see that as far as being better is concerned, perhaps getting more marks on performance is concerned, the real wars tell us that perhaps, these weapons are better. Now, very quickly, there's another level, there's another layer to it where he asks me about the Russia-Ukraine war.
Yeah.
Now, the Russia-Ukraine war, yes, of course, I've gone to Ukraine, and my purpose of going to Ukraine was also to get a first-hand view of what really is happening on the ground, because the rhetoric that you see coming from either Russia or Ukraine is very different from the reality on the ground. And because I'm writing an entire book on it, of course, I have to go there and see and talk to people about how they're feeling. Now, very quickly, the Russia-Ukraine war and the performance of weapons is a very complicated topic. In fact, I'm going to be doing a worldview on this very soon with somebody I don't want to give away the name of again, but you should watch it because it is going to be on the military strategy of how the two sides have kind of, adapted in the face of challenges. But why Russia-Ukraine war is a complicated thing? Because Ukraine has, yes, there is little doubt that Ukraine has been able to survive because of Western weapons, but those Western weapons have never come on time. They have never been enough. And if they have come, for the longest time, they came with restrictions to be used, right?
The terms and conditions.
So what Ukraine has done is that Ukraine has kind of synthesized the Western weapons, its Soviet-era weapons, and its own adaptations, right? Technological innovations in terms of drones, etc., etc. So that makes Ukraine a very, very unique case study.
That's interesting. In real time. In
real time, as a war is evolving. So that makes Ukraine a very, very interesting case study, and it's more like a hybrid, confluence of different technologies which are evolving. So Ukraine is like a live laboratory, frankly. And most of these NATO officers from different countries that are there in Kyiv, etc., the Ramstein group, etc., they are actually learning those key takeaways about how is a particular technology really effective in a wartime situation or not. So there, I would sort of leave it for the while, because if I start talking too much about it, why will you come back for the worldview? And I want you to come back for it. But Russia-Ukraine war is a special case, because I certainly want to talk about how the two sides have adapted. And there is just this last bit of jigsaw puzzle that we need to put in there before we conclude this topic on whether the Western weapons are better or the Russian weapons are better. See, there's no doubt about the fact that India and Russia's weapon relationship is quite ancient, in the sense that it goes back decades, right? That's one. India is still dependent on a lot of military hardware on Russia, right? And that modernization that it seeks to have, like we seek to have, cannot come overnight. But a very quick thing that I will say, and I will rest my case after that, is that ever since the war in Ukraine has started, the Indian side has not given a fresh order to Russia. There are internal assessments which really cause worry, which is about the performance of the S-400 system. So these two things will tell you that, yes, there is a lot of analysis which is also going on in India about the performance of the Russian weapons, and a lot of those weapons that we buy, okay? The case in point being the S-400 system. Does that mean the Russian weapons are bad? No. It's always a matter of comparative analysis and being really good or really bad. But right now, if you look at what the Indian establishment is doing, yes, you can see that there is a clear diversification away from Russian sources, even though the licensed productions on Sukhoi Mk-30s or the BrahMos production remains a star performer. And, full marks to that, because no other Western power has actually shown that kind of a transfer of technology, with India. So we have to keep these nuances in mind as well. But the new age defense industry relationships that India has are all with countries like France, again, an old partner, the US, Israel, and so many European partners as well. So, or there is a push for self-reliance. So you do see these are things that are never sort of writing on the wall. I mean, it would never be that obvious, but it is for you to understand, to try and put two into two together, that regardless of whatever the public or the popular opinion might say, when it comes to taking professional decisions, the analysis is done in a very objective manner.
That's really interesting. And I guess it speaks to the other part of the question which was asked, which is that, is India's story one of missed opportunities? Are we just kind of trying to play catch up to China?
See, there is no denying the fact that when it comes to military capabilities, yes, China does outdo India very, very clearly. China surpasses. But what we need to do, right, is to have a strategic realism for these things,
Right.
Exaggerated narratives of we are very good or we are very bad. These extremes should be avoided. I mean, I myself have written about it and I said that why are we constantly looking for an eternally feel good factor or an eternally feel bad factor? The reality is always somewhere in the middle, right?
Yeah.
So there are, so of course, I mean, the China did take everybody by surprise when it kind of unveiled not one but two sixth generation aircrafts. I did an entire worldview on that. Please see it. I got a fighter, a pilot from a retired fighter pilot from the Air Force, and he went into the details of how much of it is propaganda, how much of it is reality, etc., etc. That's one part. The other part is about the DeepSeek, right? My Friday column has been on the DeepSeek and why at least DeepSeek is more of a bit of a propaganda than reality, because what it has done is that while there is no denying the fact that they have been able to achieve better results than compared to ChatGPT,
at a lower
but
cost,
at a much lower cost, not just lower cost, but a much lower cost, maybe fraction of that cost. But at the same time, its base model remains to be ChatGPT. And what China has done is that it has copy pasted that basic algorithm, that API, and then sort of, built the scale and then use that as a model to then, come out with their reasoning model. I mean, you can just go and read my column. The link to it is given in the description box as well. But as far as these things are concerned, one has to be more realistic. There was also a role, Vandana, of how the US export controls on these advanced chips did not really work well, because at that time in 2022 October to 2023 October, when the Biden administration went gaga about having export control so that they kind of cut off China from the advanced chips. But at the same time, if you go into the world of chips, right, the chips that were allowed to be exported were H800 variety, and and while the US was using a more advanced version of it, which is called the H100 variety. But if you look into the engineering bit of these chips, frankly, there was very little difference, and there was always a potential for the H800 to be sort of utilized as the advanced ones. And you would be surprised, by the way, that between 2022 October to all the way during 2023 until the time the financial year in 2024 ended, China alone, and DeepSeek, of course, was a big player there, bought $10 billion worth of these chips. Wow. Based on which they have now come up with these models. So there is a lot that goes, between the lines that you have to study. And like I said, there is no denying the fact that China is much more advanced when it comes to the capabilities. But not everything that China says has to be taken on face value. Where is India standing there? Yes, of course, India cannot go solo. India, in fact, now should not go solo, because we can't be now waiting for another decade of putting more investment in our R&D. I think the global digital order is emerging very fast, whether it's the global military order. I think we have to be very pragmatic. We have to keep our international interests first and go with partners that help us build our capabilities, right? While trying to protect our strategic autonomy as much as possible. And I do not see India becoming a formal ally in the process to anyone, but for sure time is a factor and it is running out fast.
Right. I mean, lots to think about, but actually for our last question, I'm going to ask you to give us a little bit of a history lesson. Okay. Our last question for today's episode is from Alex Manusko, who asks, why don't Indians take into account the contributions of Ukrainians and other countries during World War II while fighting the Nazis? Instead, why does India give all the merit to Russians?
Well, so to first put it in perspective, I do see why I've been saying that the Ukraine war has been an enabler of conversations that did not exist before.
Yeah.
So yes, it is true that from India's perspective, when we say India-Russia relations go back a long time, actually we mean India-Soviet Union relations. And Soviet Union relations was, apart from Russia, there were 14 other countries that were members of the USSR. So India, of course, did not have any ties with Imperial Russia. So that is what happens that a lot of times when you are talking about a friendly country that with whom you have sort of decades of trust, you kind of get into these technical errors, referring to your relationship and the different markers of your relationship and the role of that country. So, for example, when it is said that it was the Soviet Union that fought the Nazis, right? Somewhere Russia has been successful in appropriating that historical
narrative,
as a Russian narrative, while it has been a Soviet narrative. And today, especially because of the war in Ukraine, etc., etc., if you remember when the war in Ukraine started, President Putin said that one of the war aims, one was, of course, the militarization of Ukraine, that he said that the West has pumped weapons into Ukraine. The second, in fact, the first war objective was denazification.
Right.
And that denazification is actually coming from that lived history that Soviet Union was the one that fought its biggest battle and was the one that kind of
liberated.
I mean, basically lost a significant part of its population in fighting the Nazis. So whenever there has been a crisis of legitimacy in Russia, it has always been about denazifying.
I see.
So Nazification is seen because right now, I mean, you can get into the details of, okay, this battalion is Nazi and that battalion, but this is not a narrative which has come only in the Ukraine war. If you understand the Russian history, every time there is you need to find a hook or a peg where you want to sort of, which you want to use to be justified as a certain act for a certain action. More often than not, it's called, oh, this is done for the sake of denazification, because denazification was so important, like a post-colonial experience. So these are experiential distillates which are very valid, but where things go wrong is where you're not able to tell between the Russian part and the Soviet part. And what I have done for you is that I've put together a chart here that actually tells you can see it on the screen as well, that if you look at the total people that died from the Soviet Republic in terms of the percentage of the population, the total people from USSR that died were about 13.7% of the total population of the USSR died fighting the Nazis. It's the Second World War, right? But if you look at that percentage in terms of population, the total Russian population that died was about 12.7%, okay? But the total Ukrainian population that died was about 16.3%. So technically speaking, I mean, apart from all the general discussions that we love to have, but if you were to write a paper on it, you would have to footnote. And if you get into the footnotes, it is true that Ukrainians have lost more lives in fighting the Nazi forces during the Second World War, because as a percentage of their population, 16.3% Ukrainians were the ones that lost their lives compared to 12.7% for Russians. And then it's not just Ukrainians, it's also Belarusians, it's Kazakhs, it's Uzbeks, it's Lithuanian. The entire chart is there for you to see. So I think what it helps to understand is not to kind of belittle certain sections, contributions or sacrifices, but to put it into the right perspective. Because if you don't put things into right perspective, you are bound to come to very wrong, I would say, conclusions. And it, like I said, that one of the things is that India-Soviet relations need to be understood in a better way. Although Russia was the main player, but there were also other players. And when they say that this has been appropriated, I think somewhere when we don't even talk about that, even at a scholarly level or an analytical level, we're kind of aiding to that, instead of trying to demystify it. So I think that's a very good question, Alex. And like I said, that this has been a conversation that we seldom have. I mean, apart from East European specialists or Soviet era specialists. So thank you for mainstreaming it.
Yeah. And on that note, I think a very important note on how to read history and the various perspectives to it. We leave it here for today. Thank you so much for joining us, Swasti, and thank you so much for watching. And please join us next week for our next episode. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure, Vandana.